From 1997 to June 12, 2001, a criminal enterprise operated in Norwalk, Connecticut. We will be referring to this enterprise as the Burton organization in this video. This gang was involved in extensive drug trafficking, and they eventually started resorting to violence and intimidation in order to maintain their grip on the local drug market, establish their dominance, protect their members, and enforce their reputation in the Norwalk area. It all began in 1997 when Kelvin Burton, also known as Waffle, Uncle, or Unk, became involved in selling cocaine and crack cocaine. Kelvin connected with large-scale suppliers, including a man named Ricardo Bermudez, and built a substantial customer base. By the end of that year, he had solidified control over key areas in South Norwalk. These included the King Kennedy Housing Project, the Rudner Court Housing Project, Boughton Street, and an area near South Main Street, and the Carlton Court Housing Project called the Maniac Block. By 1998, the operation was thriving. Kelvin's success incentivized others to join him, many of them his own family members, and they formed the core of the Burton organization. By 1999, key players in the organization included David DMX Burton, Jermaine Buchanan, David QB Burton, Tony Burton, and St. Clair Burton. Since there are two Davids, we will be using their nicknames to avoid any confusion. These individuals played critical roles in the enterprise. They packaged drugs at a stash house located at 27 Lincoln Avenue and distributed crack and cocaine to street-level dealers in the different housing projects and territories dominated by the organization. As the founder of the organization, Kelvin Burton was always the leader, even during stints in prison in 2000 and 2001. Kelvin controlled the drug supply, recruited members, and instructed them to carry out orders which were often violent, and assigned roles within the organization. From 1999, DMX was a lieutenant in the organization, handling deliveries to street-level dealers and collecting money from them to funnel back to Kelvin. Kelvin would then take the money and give it to his father Barney Burton, who would store it. Jermaine, QB, and St. Clair served as enforcers. They not only packaged and sold drugs, but they also used their firearms in response to any perceived threats against the organization. Regular meetings were held at the Stash House, where the group discussed business and planned and coordinated attacks against rival drug dealers in South Norwalk. The Stash House also served as a hub for the group's operations, and it was where decisions about the organization's day-to-day activities were made. The Stash House was where Kelvin and DMX frequently met with their suppliers at, and where the organization stored drugs, drug packaging materials, and large amounts of cash. Additionally, the organization kept an arsenal of weapons at the Stash House, including a Mac-11, a Beretta, a Glock with a laser sight, and a shotgun, which they regularly carried and shared with one another. Members of the organization, including Kelvin, DMX, and St. Clair, also lived there at various times. In 1997 and 1998, the Burton organization sourced kilograms of crack cocaine from Ricardo Bermudez, usually around 1 kilogram a week. By 1998, the organization transitioned to a new supplier, Claude Geroncon. Through Claude, they obtained kilograms of both crack and powder cocaine. Claude became their primary supplier from 1998 to 2000, at times providing more than 1 kilogram of cocaine per week. In late 1998 or early 1999, Kelvin learned how to convert powder cocaine into crack cocaine. This marked a turning point. He began purchasing powder cocaine from Claude and cooking it into crack at the Stash House. Jermaine, QB, and Levon Godfrey helped package the crack for street-level distribution. The operation was immensely profitable, generating thousands of dollars daily. The money from the street-level dealers would be funneled back to Kelvin, who stored the cash at the Stash House. Kelvin would then take the money in $10,000 increments and give it to his father, Barney Burton, for safekeeping. The Burton organization members loved flaunting the money that their drug operation brought in. In early 1999, Kelvin purchased a Mercedes-Benz for over $60,000 in cash. Around the same time, St. Clair bought a BMW, and in 2000, Willie Prezi purchased a BMW X5 for over $60,000. In August 1999, members of the organization, including Kelvin, DMX, and St. Clair, visited Tony Burton, who had just been released from jail, to a halfway house. During the visit, Kelvin encouraged Tony to join the organization once he was fully released, pointing to the luxury cars parked outside the halfway house, including the Mercedes and the BMW. Kelvin reportedly said, quote, "Look how we're rolling now." While Kelvin was serving a state sentence in 2001, DMX took the lead in sourcing drugs, and he started purchasing crack cocaine from Ernest Eugene Weldon as well. DMX was also responsible for keeping Kelvin's cousin, QB, updated on the organization's drug supply. Between 1998 and 2000, as the Burton organization's drug trafficking empire was booming, members committed numerous acts of violence. The violence reached its peak during two significant beefs between 1998 and 1999. The first beef involved the Hill Crew, a rival group of crack dealers who controlled the drug trade in the Carlton Court housing project. Members of the Hill Crew included Roderick Richardson, Shacky Sumter, Terrence McNichols, Eric McKinney, Michael Dawson, Fred Hatton, and Tara Nevins. On January 21, 1998, Shacky and Roderick ambushed members of the Burton organization. It all started when Willie Prezi fronted drugs to Roderick, obviously expecting payment for the drugs at some point. Roderick, however, had other plans. After failing to pay, he lured Jermaine, Willie, Demetrius Story, and Kelvin's brother, Sean Burton, to a meeting under the guise of settling the debt. However, instead of paying them back for the drugs, Shacky and Roderick attempted to rob them, firing multiple shots into the car where the Burton organization members were seated. Sean was hit but survived. Kelvin immediately started planning a retaliatory response. He met with core members of the organization, including Jermaine and DMX, at the stash house. Kelvin distributed weapons and instructed members to start looking for Shacky and Roderick, even extending their hunt to Bridgeport. However, they were unable to locate the targets. 2 months later, on March 21st, the conflict intensified. Members of the Hill Crew, led by Terrence McNichols, also known as Doughboy, drove to the Burton organization's stash house. Jermaine, Kelvin, Levon, Sean, and Terrence Burton were all at the stash house when the Hill Crew members arrived. The two groups confronted one another, and Jermaine struck Terrence McNichols in the face with a firearm, which provoked Terrence to open fire. Sean had a handgun and fired back, and while no one was seriously injured, this incident further escalated the animosity between the two groups. Meanwhile, another feud was brewing. In 1997 and early 1998, Kelvin Burton had been supplying crack cocaine to an individual named Marquise Young. However, in the spring of 1998, this relationship soured. Two of Marquise's associates, Peter Diaz and Brandon Miles, attacked and beat up Terrence Burton in the King Kennedy housing project while Marquise stood by and watched. After this incident, Kelvin decided to cut off Marquise's supply of drugs. On May 13, 1998, tensions reached a boiling point. Marquise Young, Peter Diaz, and Ida Young were driving near South Main Street when they crossed paths with Sean Burton. A confrontation quickly escalated. Sean started making hostile comments toward Peter, who responded by fatally shooting Sean. Kelvin became enraged once he heard about his brother's murder. He blamed both Peter and Marquise for Sean's death and quickly began plotting his revenge. Marquise was eventually arrested for his role in Sean's murder. However, his arrest didn't quench Kelvin's thirst for revenge. On one occasion during a court recess, Kelvin, along with brothers Keith and Chuck Lyons, assaulted Marquise. Eventually, the charges against Marquise were dropped for lack of probable cause, and Kelvin and Jermaine later confronted him outside the courthouse. The Burton organization members began threatening Marquise. The confrontation was very intense, but just before things got out of hand, Marquise's uncle stepped in and prevented any violence from breaking out. By the summer of 1998, the Burton organization controlled critical drug markets in South Norwalk, but challenges from the Hill Crew and the conflict with Marquise Young threatened their dominance. In November 1998, Cedric Burton wrote a letter to his brother DMX from jail. He talked about the ongoing war against the other team, and he pledged his support to his family's organization, which he called a team, and said that shit can't go unanswered. He wrote, urging David to prepare the metal jackets, meaning guns and ammo. Cedric made one request to his family. He wanted the team to wait for his return from jail before launching any further attacks. In late 1998 and 1999, the conflict between the Burton organization and the Hill Crew escalated to deadly levels. Roderick Richardson was spotted near Carlton Court one day. Viewing Roderick as the heart of the Hill crew, the Burton organization decided to target him. Kelvin, alongside DMX, Jermaine, QB, Levon, and others, then grabbed a Beretta 9mm from their stash house. Jermaine took the gun, drove to where Roderick had been seen, and opened fire, unleashing multiple rounds in his direction. However, none of the bullets hit him. Kelvin then made it clear that Roderick had to be dealt with sooner or later. In June 1999, Roderick and Kelvin had a heated exchange in front of Le New Moon Cafe, a bar controlled by the Burton organization, which was later bought by the Burton family. This bar was also used by the organization to traffic and distribute drugs. During the confrontation, Roderick walked by Kelvin's Mercedes-Benz when he heard Kelvin cock a gun. Roderick then boldly challenged Kelvin, asking why he hadn't avenged his brother's death yet. The very next day, Jermaine retaliated. Wearing a hooded sweatshirt, Jermaine waited in the shadows along Burton Street. When he saw Roderick, he approached him and fired 2 shots in his direction. One of the bullets hit Roderick in the arm just below his left bicep. After the attack, Jermaine returned to the stash house and reported back to Kelvin, DMX, Levon, and others and told them what he had done. Kelvin's response was, quote, "It's about time you did something." On August 24, 1999, Kelvin, St. Clair, DMX, and others drove into the Carlton Court housing project in 2 vehicles, searching for Hill crew members. They found Roderick Richardson, Fred Hatton, Andre Dawson, Tara Nivens, and others gathered there. Someone had told Kelvin earlier that someone from the Hill crew was threatening his cousin QB. Based on that information, Kelvin directly confronted the group, demanding to know who was targeting his family. Tara stepped up, challenging Kelvin and taunting him to get out of the car and fight. Kelvin responded saying, quote, "I don't fight. I pay to get things done." During the confrontation, St. Clair asked Kelvin to drive to the stash house so that he could get a gun. Before they could leave, Andre pointed his gun at Kelvin and fired a shot, striking him in the chest. The tension between the Burton organization and the Hill crew reached new heights in the days after Kelvin got shot. Andre started provoking the Burton organization and he left a voicemail for DMX stating, quote, "Peace God, I took your bitch. Now it's on you to make the next move." DMX then shared the message with his associates, including Anthony Burton and Cedric Burton, who had just gotten out of jail. After hearing the message, Cedric said that he will kill Andre, and Anthony agreed with this plan. On September 2, 1999, Hill crew member Fred Hatton shot Andre McClendon, a South Norwalk drug dealer who was affiliated with the Burton organization. Andre McClendon managed to escape and return to the stash house, where Burton organization members were at, including Kelvin, DMX, QB, St. Clair, and Levon. As Kelvin patched up Andre McClendon's gunshot wound, the group began plotting their revenge, and they eventually decided that they would shoot up the Carlton Court housing project. DMX, QB, St. Clair, and Donald Thigpen armed themselves with weapons from the stash house basement, including a Beretta 9mm, a Mac 11 semi-automatic 9mm, a shotgun, and a .38 caliber or .357 type revolver, and set out for Carlton Court. Shortly after midnight on September 3rd, the group arrived at Carlton Court and spotted a man with dreadlocks who looked like Fred, standing with 2 others. The Burton organization members then opened fire and sprayed bullets in the area, using all the weapons they carried with them. One of the shots struck the man with the dreadlocks in the lower back as he attempted to flee. The group then returned to the stash house and reported what they had done to Kelvin and Levon. However, it wasn't long before they learned the truth. The man with the dreadlocks wasn't Fred. It turned out that the man they had shot in the back was Arnold Blake, an innocent bystander who was a teacher. He taught 3- and 4-year-olds at a local Head Start program, which offers extensive early childhood education, health, nutrition, and parent engagement services to low-income children and families. Cedric and Tony later approached Arnold to apologize to him on behalf of the Burton organization. On the evening of October 6, 1999, QB deliberately drove through Hill territory in Norwalk in a white Honda Accord, repeatedly taunting Fred and Roderick. At one point, he even stopped and spat in their direction. In response to this, Fred fired multiple shots at the car, narrowly missing QB. QB then sped away, only to be pulled over moments later by Norwalk police officers near Carlton Court. Furious, QB made his intentions clear, telling the officers, quote, "Next time I will take care of those N-words myself," and adding, "I'm going to kill them." On October 10th, 1999, Cedric was at the stash house and was cleaning an arsenal of weapons in preparation for retaliation. Later on in the day, Kelvin spotted Fred and Roderick standing in front of Le New Moon Cafe. He immediately contacted DMX, saying, "They're out there now, come through." At the time of the call, DMX was driving with his brother Cedric and QB. The three headed to the bar and quickly located Roderick and Fred. Cedric, who was seated in the front passenger seat, leaned across his brother and pointed a handgun at the two men. Spotting the weapon, Roderick and Fred started running. What followed was a chaotic and dangerous running gun battle through the streets of Norwalk. The Burton organization members fired at Roderick and Fred, while Roderick returned fire in an attempt to defend himself. Following this drive-by shooting, the members of the Hill crew scattered to avoid further retaliation. Roderick moved to the Carolinas, Andre relocated to Florida, and Fred began serving a prison sentence. From late 1999 onwards, the Burton organization faced no issues with the Hill crew, and during this period, the Burton organization expanded its drug operations, even developing a customer base that included street-level dealers operating in the Carlton Court housing project, a territory previously dominated by the Hill crew. As the Burton organization was focusing on taking down the Hill crew, they were also focused on retaliating against Marquise Young for his role in the death of Sean Burton. In the spring of 1999, Kelvin, QB, Willie, and others attended a parade in New Haven. When Marquise, who was also at the parade, approached the group, Kelvin confronted him, saying, quote, "You are not tough, since when you became a killer, you will get yours in due time." As Kelvin was threatening Marquise, QB, who was standing beside Kelvin, gestured to the .38 caliber revolver tucked into his waistband. Despite the heated exchange, no physical violence occurred at that time. In June 1999, tensions escalated further when Willie saw Marquise at Le New Moon Cafe. Marquise warned Willie to leave town and avoid the Burtons so he would not get caught in any crossfire. Willie then proceeded to tell Kelvin about what Marquise had told him. Kelvin was furious that Willie hadn't called him immediately, as he had instructed all members of the organization to call him if they ever saw Marquise. This incident prompted Kelvin to call a meeting the following week to plan Marquise's murder. The following Friday night, the Burton organization launched their plan. DMX, Kelvin, Jermaine, and others gathered at the stash house to arm themselves with firearms, including a Glock 9mm with laser sighting which was carried by Kelvin. They searched Le New Moon Cafe and its surrounding area for Marquise but failed to locate him that night. The plan was to find Marquise and shoot him after he got into his car. However, they obviously could not follow through with their plan on that Friday night. Several events after this escalated the feud between Marquise and the Burton organization. For example, Marquise was once spotted in Bridgeport near Poplar Street, where Levon lived. Although Levon stayed at the stash house in Norwalk for some nights, he also spent many nights at his place at Bridgeport. Concerned about his safety, Levon asked QB for a weapon and was given a .38 caliber handgun. Additionally, around the same time, and as mentioned earlier in the video, Hill crew member Roderick Richardson taunted Kelvin for failing to avenge his brother's death. In June 1999, Jermaine and Kelvin started discussing and forming a new plan to kill Marquise. Kelvin suggested that the murder should take place in Bridgeport instead of Norwalk, stating that it would be better to kill him there because Bridgeport has way more frequent shootings than Norwalk, and so this would make it less likely for the murder to be linked back to the Burton organization. Kelvin also gave Jermaine a firearm and said that if the police ever asked them about their whereabouts during the time of the murder, their girlfriends could fabricate alibis for them. Jermaine also told Willie that Marquise was aware that the Burtons were looking for him and wanted him dead, and that killing him preemptively was necessary to ensure everyone's safety. Their new plan came to fruition on the night of July 1st, 1999, just 3 days after Jermaine shot Hill crew member Roderick Richardson. Shortly after midnight, Jermaine and his associate Angel Cabrera were passengers in a white car that followed Marquise and Derek Owens from a sandwich shop in Bridgeport to Marquise's home on Lenox Avenue in Bridgeport. Marquise was sitting in the passenger seat of a green Honda Accord, and Derek was driving the car. Marquise and Derek then parked outside Marquise's home and discussed a family trip to Hershey Park, which they planned for the next morning. As the two men talked, Jermaine and Angel drove by and started shooting. They fired over 25 rounds from two 9mm guns, many of which struck Derek and Marquise. Derek, who was an innocent bystander, was fatally wounded, succumbing to his injuries on the scene. Marquise was riddled with bullets and was critically injured. While Marquise survived the attack, he was left paralyzed from the waist down, rendering him a T3 paraplegic. Ballistics evidence confirmed that both men had been struck by bullets from both firearms used in the attack. Around midnight, while Jermaine and Angel were executing the plan to kill Marquise, Kelvin arrived at the stash house where Levon already was and greeted him. Early the next morning after the shooting, between 6 and 7 a.m., Kelvin woke Levon up to tell him about the shooting, stating that Marquise had been critically injured and Derek had been killed. Kelvin was sweating and acting strangely. Later that morning, Kelvin confided in Willie, saying that the shooters did the Burtons a favor. Kelvin also mentioned Jermaine's behavior, saying that he was going around bragging about the shooting. After the shooting, the Burton organization members started taking active steps to maintain a low profile. For example, Kelvin instructed DMX and St. Clair to remove all drugs from the stash house. Within 2 days of the shooting, Kelvin, DMX, and other members of the organization fled the state and traveled to Virginia Beach. Additionally, Jermaine, who had previously spent nearly every day in South Norwalk, started avoiding the area entirely. Jermaine Buchanan and Angel Cabrera were eventually arrested for the murder of Derek Owens, and the state's murder trial against the two men was set to start in early January 2001. Marquise was set to testify against them, and in late 2000, DMX spotted Marquise in a car parked near the Burton organization's stash house. DMX then proceeded to threaten a paralyzed Marquise in an attempt to stop him from testifying. This threat was also caught on wiretap recordings of conversations between Kelvin and DMX where they discussed the incident. On one occasion, DMX and Levon went to deliver crack cocaine to a customer. When the customer attempted to run away without paying for the drugs, DMX quickly drew a Beretta 9mm handgun and fired at the customer. On September 10, 2000, DMX confronted Orleanas Betances, a drug user who owed the organization a drug debt. During the confrontation, DMX asked Orleanas for the money he owed, and the two men began fighting. During the fight, DMX again brandished his Beretta 9mm handgun. Norwalk police eventually arrived on the scene, and DMX subsequently discarded the weapon. The police recovered the handgun, and subsequent ballistics analysis linked it to shell casings recovered from the shootout in front of the stash house and the shooting of Arnold Blake. On December 17, 2001, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against key members of the Burton organization. Among those charged were Kelvin Burton, David DMX Burton, Jermaine Buchanan, David QB Burton, and others. The charges included violations of the Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, violent crimes in aid of racketeering, and conspiracy to distribute cocaine and cocaine base. Additionally, specific allegations were leveled against individual defendants. Kelvin Burton faced charges for the distribution of cocaine base, along with criminal forfeiture proceedings targeting his assets. Similarly, David DMX Burton was charged with distributing cocaine and also possessing a 9mm handgun in furtherance of a drug trafficking crime. The government's case against the Burton organization was built on overwhelming evidence. This included consensual recordings, drugs seized during controlled purchases from members of the organizations and its customers and associates, multiple firearms and ammunition, bulletproof vests, and large amounts of cash. Investigators also recovered narcotics processing and packaging materials, counter-surveillance equipment, and scales during raids. Wiretaps of phone calls and prison phone recordings were also introduced. Additionally, evidence from shooting scenes like shell casings and bullet fragments also helped convict the members of the Burton organization. On February 11, 2003, after a 6-week trial, The jury returned a verdict finding the Burton organization members guilty of various racketeering and narcotics-related charges. On October 8, 2003, David Q.B. Burton was sentenced to 210 months in prison. On November 5, 2003, Kelvin Burton was sentenced to life in prison. On November 24, 2003, David D.M.X. Burton was sentenced to 350 months in prison. Lastly, on April 12, 2004, Jermaine Buchanan was sentenced to life in prison. Thank you for watching.